All right, kamapona, yan aleo kamapona. All right, as I mentioned, today I'm going to be teaching about transitive prepositions. Now, a little forward about transitive prepositions is that these are not a standard way to speak Toki Pona. They are not documented in Poo. They are not really used in any official capacity. However, there are a lot of very proficient speakers who use this nasin. And today we're going to talk about why it is, as well as what you can do with this nasin. Now, to anybody who's come to these lessons before, you know I talked about transitive prepositions at least a bit in a previous lesson. Today we're going to be going over specific examples with all of Toki Pona's prepositions. All right, and we are going to be starting with tawa. So first, we should talk about tawa as a preposition in general, right? Of course, as a word, it means things that are moving, going in a particular direction, and these can be any kind of movement. It can be both physical movement, as in I move from one place to another, and it can be interpersonal movement, like something can be in somebody's opinion or given to somebody, right? Both of these things are common ways to think about tawa. And so, tawa as a preposition usually means something like, let's say, mi pana e io tawa sina. I give a thing to you, right? So we can give something to somebody, or we can say, nili pona tawa mi. This is good to me. Something is good in my opinion. Mi pali e ni tawa sina. I create this for you, right? Different meanings of tawa. But if we explore it as a transitive preposition, so to be clear about what that means, let's say, mi tawa sina e io. Mi tawa sina e io. Right, so mi tawa sina e io, if you look at this in, let's say, a normal context, let's interpret it literally first. You would look at this and say, okay, first person, me, I, you move a thing. Well, we can interpret this without interpreting it as a transitive preposition, and a lot of the time, it will give us a correct interpretation. What is a you move, right? Well, a you move is either moving something it's some kind of moving that is related to you, right? So that could be moving something in the same way as you, something that is similar to how you move. Or it could be moving something to your vicinity. It could be making it yours, right? In this case, tawa sina, interpreted as a prepositional phrase, is to you. In other words, here we're applying moving to you to the thing. That means we are moving the thing to you. And that is as simple as it gets, as a matter of fact. You can, like I said, interpret this without it necessarily being a transitive prepositional phrase, but interpreting it that way does make this a lot more clear about what is meant. Now, something to note about this is that this version of the tawa prepositional phrase can't really express interpersonal movements as well. Certainly it is capable of it, but if you think about it, if I say tawa sina, tawa yan, or other things like that, we kind of end up with results like some kind of movement when you think about it. And it's always some kind of physical movement, because the ultimate result here is that we are operating on some object, right? If you think about the difference between mi tawa io versus mi tawa e io, the same applies here. If I say mi tawa io, that would be something like I move to the thing. But if I say mi tawa e io, it is I move the thing. Again, the same applies here. So mi tawa e io is the ultimate important statement of this sentence. And the fact that sina is here is just more information about what kind of tawa we're doing. But it does mean that this is essentially a verb phrase, a transitive verb that we are applying to io, right? We're moving the thing. All right, let's look at another example. Where did my pen go? behind me. Maybe. Let's clear that. Okay, how about mi tawa tomo e ilo e pali, let's say. Mi tawa tomo e ilo e pali. So this is kind of a similar case, but we have multiple applications of the transitive preposition. In this case, we have two e for a single transitive preposition. Mi tawa tomo means I move to the house, but in this case, since it's transitive, we have the object marker e here. We say I move something else to the house or to the room, building. Of course, tomo has a lot of variety in it. But mi tawa tomo e ilo, I move the tools to the house. Mi tawa tomo e pali, I move the creations, the work, to the house. In other words, we're saying I move the tools and the creations to the house or the work, right? Transitive prepositions also work with multiple objects, right? Same logic as a transitive verb without it being a prepositional phrase. Any questions about this so far?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you wanted to express a more complicated thing that you're saying towards, like tawa tomupali or something, would you say tawa pi tomupali, or would it just be tawa tomupali?
So since this is a prepositional phrase, you would say tawa tomopali, right? It does have the same set of rules as a prepositional phrase. And so, yeah, you would say tawa tomopali, mi tawa tomopali e ilo e pali, right? I move the tools and the work to a working house. Now, that does make it a little weirder to look at, especially if somebody you're talking to doesn't use transitive prepositions. So in that case, if you wanted to be more clear, I would encourage you to restate yourself without transitive prepositions. But no, you would not use P there because these are still prepositional phrases. The same way you wouldn't say, mi pana e io tawa yan pikamasona. Or excuse me. Let me correct that. Mi pana e io tawa pi kulupusona. Mi pana e io tawa pi kulupusona is an example of it being wrong, right? You would just say mi pana e io tawa kulupusona, for example. Does that make sense? Yeah, it took me a moment there to come up with a negative example because it's like, I've been speaking for quite a while. It's hard to think of how to do it wrong. So yeah, transitive prepositions, you always treat them like prepositions still, so you don't use P. That being said, it is worth thinking about the fact that, let's say, mitawa tomo pali, right? So let's say we didn't use transitive prepositions, but we still wanted to try and interpret this statement correctly. Well, we know that mi is tawaing some ilo and some pali, right? And we don't necessarily have to think about these adjectives here. We know that the core of the sentence is this person, me, whoever is speaking, is moving tools and work, right? Now, then we can step back to think about what does it mean to have a tawa that is both tomo and pali, right? And I personally think if somebody were to try and interpret this without thinking of this phrase, this verb phrase, as a prepositional phrase, they might still come across the fact that this information about where the thing is being moved to is simply stored here in tawa. We're saying we working house move the tools and the work, right? And it would certainly be weird to somebody who didn't understand transitive prepositions. But again, it would not be unintelligible, if that distinction makes sense. Of course, it's worth taking a moment here to think about the fact that, again, not everyone uses transitive prepositions, and this lesson is entirely exploratory. So in that case, you would restate yourself if somebody didn't understand you. Somebody says, "O toki sin." You go to them and say, "Ah, mi pana e ilo e pali tawa tomo pali." Right? You would restate yourself in a much more familiar nasin to nasin pu. And again, I would encourage that pretty much no matter what you do. Like, if somebody doesn't understand you, pick whatever is the most reasonable way to make yourself better understood. If that means using more words, spending more time to explain a concept, or simply restating yourself with different words, whatever is necessary, because your goal is to communicate, yes? So yeah. Any more questions about tawa? All right, then in that case, we are going to move on to lon. So let's talk about lon as a preposition for a moment. Normally, it provides locational context, and it can also provide subject context. So, for example, mi toki lon Toki Pona could be something like, I speak about a simple language. And that's a relatively common interpretation. In a similar vein, you could say, mi toki lon tomo, I speak in a room or in a building. Mi toki lon mapona, I speak in a good place, right? Or perhaps on very good dirt. So lon is about providing, I would say, subject and location context, right? So lon as a preposition, as a transitive prepositional phrase, we're providing some locational or subject context to an object, right? So I could say, yan li lon, let's say, Toki Pona. Excuse me, that P is atrocious. Yan li lon Toki Pona e lipu. And let's think about that for a moment. This is a bit of a weirder one to think about, right? Because now we're applying a context to an object that already exists. It's not a wrong way to think about it. But it definitely is a little weirder than thinking about tawa as a prepositional, as a transitive prep phrase. So here, we're saying a person makes a lipu about Toki Pona. And that's not to say they're creating it. They are essentially giving it a subject, giving the lipu a subject, right? And you might say that this is a roundabout way to like choose the topic of a book that you're writing, right? If you wanted to restate this in a more common nasin, you could say separately, yan li pali e lipu li toki. I've written an E. Toki, excuse me, lon Toki Pona. There we go. So here we've split it up into two separate sentences. Yan li pali e lipu li toki lon Toki Pona. Right? But this is kind of all of the information expressed by this singular prepositional phrase, right? Because, again, we can apply the same logic as we did with the longer phrase for tawa. So here, the core of the sentence is we have yan as a subject, lon as the head noun of the verb, and lipu as the object. So if we think about yan li lon e lipu, well, what does it mean to lon e io in general? When you lon something, when you apply lon to something, it means you make it exist, right? And so here, the core of this sentence is saying a person is making something exist and that something is a lipu, right? And so now we reintroduce the context of lon to think about, oh, what is the lon actually saying? Yan li lon Toki Pona lipu. A person is making a book exist, and that book is about Toki Pona. Or more exactly, they're making the book be about Toki Pona. Any questions about lon? Awesome. Okay. So there's one more cool example with lon, which is very similar to tawa. As I mentioned before, lon provides locational context, and we can use that here too. Mi lon lupa e kasi lili. Mi lon lupa e kasi lili. Interpreted literally, that's something like, I make the plant exist in the hole. Again, we can think about this right here. Mi lon e kasi lili. So I make the plant, the small plant exist, and then lon is about some lupa. So in this case, I whole exist the plant, the small plant. Now, obviously, if we were to think about that in English a little bit too far, it would stop making sense, right? Making something whole exist, that's not an English concept. There's no words I could use to describe that more usefully. I would have to break it up into a sentence, right? But here, as a transitive prepositional phrase, we're basically saying, mi pana e kasi lili tawa lupa, right? Or you could also, in a similar vein, say, mi tawa e kasi lili tawa lupa, right? Either way, you're moving it, you're giving it, you're placing the plant in the hole, you're making it exist in the hole. Or stated simply in English, you're planting it, right? And so this is the locational version of lon as a prepositional phrase, right? It is capable of expressing where something is moved to, but not in the sense of moving it necessarily, even though that would be implied, because of course tawa does that. But it does mean in the sense of something comes to be at a location, right? So any more questions about lon? Cool. All right. Then we are going to move on to, excuse me, sama. So sama is very cool as a preposition because it has a lot of space that it can work with, right? But all of it is about making things, describing things that are same, similar, identical, a little bit same. They have properties in common, right? To whatever degree that two things can be similar, sama can talk about it, right? And sama, as a preposition, essentially indicates that whatever is going on in the sentence is similar to something else, right? So I could say, Sina tawamusi sama yan pona, which would be something like, you dance, you fun move in a way that's similar to a good person, right? So I could be saying, like, if we were to interpret that in English more loosely, hey, you're a good dancer. You dance like a good dancer, right? But if we now consider sama as a transitive prepositional phrase, so I could say, mi sama sina e tawa musi mi. Mi sama sina e tawa musi mi, right? This is actually a case where sama can be pretty well interpreted as not a prepositional phrase, right? You could interpret this as a verb, and it would still work really, really well. And that's kind of the strength of prepositional phrases, of transitive prepositional phrases. There are many cases where simple ones work the same as they would as verbs, right? So let's think about this. Mi sama e tawa musi mi. Or mi sama e tawa, to simplify it even further. I make the tawa similar. And in this case, the context for sama is telling us what kind of similar we are providing, right? In this case, we're making the tawa similar to you, right? Mi sama sina e tawa musi mi. That would be, I make my fun movement similar to yours, right? And you could restate this in a couple of different ways. The first thing that comes to mind is you could say, mi tawa musi sama sina. Mi tawa musi sama sina, right? And this is certainly a similar idea, but it has a problem. That problem is we've kind of lost some of the process, right? In the former case, we're saying, I am making my dancing the same as yours, right? I am performing some specific action, and that specific action is to change my dancing so it is similar to yours. But in this case, mi tawamusi samasina, it's saying, I am already dancing in the same way as you, right? It's not making any statement about changing it or about like operating on it in general, right? In this case, we're making a statement of fact about something that is already happening, or at least is going to happen in the future, right? Because Toki Pona doesn't mark tense necessarily. But in this case, we are providing a specific attribution. I am changing the way I dance here, right? And I'm making it similar to you. Does that distinction make sense? Awesome. So yeah, I would say that this particular lesson is really, really important when it comes to transitive prepositional phrases. And the reason why is because with transitive prepositional phrases, you can often state something in a way that is significantly smaller than a similar statement without them, right? And that's part of why they've become so popular in the past couple of months, especially among more proficient speakers in Mapona, because they're highly expressive. And I think Toki Pona thrives when it can express things that are deep and complex with fewer words. That's like the thing Toki Pona does, and it's shocking to see it happen, right? But Toki Pona is very, very good at that, nonetheless. So, if nobody has any more questions about sama, we have 2 more prepositions to get to. Any more questions about sama? All right. So the next 2 prepositions are a little odd in this format. And when I say they're odd, I mean one of them is highly discouraged, and we'll get to why. And the other, we'll be going over now, is tan. So let's think about tan as a content word and how it's used, what it brings to Toki Pona. Tan speaks about where things are from, what are they because of. It talks about attribution, right? What is the driving force behind this thing? What made this happen? Okay? And if you think about it, if I were to apply attribution to a thing, it doesn't necessarily work. There are cases where it does work, but it doesn't necessarily work, right? Excuse me. And the reason why it doesn't necessarily work, let's demonstrate. Mi tan sina e pakala. And you can already see where this is going, right? This is something like, I make the broken thing be caused by you, right? That's one thing. That's one way you could interpret it. And of course, it can't literally modify cause and effect, right? It's not really sensible to talk about, oh, this thing is now being caused by you. And it wouldn't make sense to make that claim. However, I make this thing, or excuse me, I claim the cause of this thing is you, is another interpretation. Essentially, I attribute this brokenness to you. Mi tan sina e pakala. Or, restated in a more nasinpu way, pakala ni li tan sina. Mi toki ni. This brokenness is from you. I said this. In other words, here, we're specifically blaming somebody for something being broken, right? This is kind of the interpretation trouble with tan. It does work really well, but again, it doesn't literally modify cause and effect. It can only modify claims about cause and effect, right? Something else that it can do, however, that is very, very useful. Mi tan yan pona e lipu. Mi tan yan pona e lipu. I make the book be from a good person, right? And the reason this works is because in the case of, like looking back at the previous example, we noted that this statement can be construed to mean, I blame you for the brokenness. Or maybe I already blamed you for the brokenness. In this case, mi tan yan pona e lipu, this is providing attribution. I attribute the book to you, right? So say you brought a book into your classroom, and then your friend, or rather, maybe not you, like that's not something that meshes with this example, but we can keep going with that context. Let's say you bring a book into your classroom, and somebody asks, hey, who brought this book? And you say, oh, this was from you. Or this was from that person being you. There you go. You can provide attribution in this way, right? You could also usually more clearly provide attribution in the form of something like lipu ni litan yan, right? But in this case, that again, this is another case where it's subtly different. If I say, here, let me write that down. Lipu ni li tan yan pona, right? Here we have, it's very, very similar to like an active voice versus passive voice difference in English, right? In the first case, we're saying that I explicitly say, this lipu is from yan pona. I am making it so, right? And that can simply be through claiming it's true, or by, say, adding them as an author on the book, or in the case I provided before, saying, hey, that book is literally from them, right? In this latter case, lipu ni litan yan pona, we're missing a little bit of information. We've now lost the information about me being an actor, and we've lost the information about their role, right? About their claim. And so, yeah, you can totally restate this without a transitive prepositional phrase. And in this case, it provides most of the information while also being shorter. But if you wanted to be completely clear about it, you have to add on mi toki ni. I said this. I made this claim. Right? Any more questions about the tan prepositional phrase? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Why not do? Can you not say mi tan? Lipuni li tan yanpona?
Lipuni li tan yanpona?
Yeah, instead of mi toki ni, could you say mi tan?
I don't see why not, honestly. I think that does work. And I think that does express a similar thing. So yeah, you could totally say mi tan there is a little bit of risk there. Obviously, in context, it is relatively clear about what statement you're making here, which is to say, mitan applies to the previous sentence. But then you may be making a different attribution, which is to say, lipu ni litan yanpona, mitan, as in, I caused this, right? And, well, maybe that does work. Right? Yeah, I think that does work. That's good. Okay, fair enough. I can't think of a good reason why that doesn't work.
For other purposes, like, do they have similar meaning then? Like me toki and ni versus me tan?
That's highly contextual, right? If I were to say me tan, it means something like I am the cause, right? And in this case, this does work because lipu ni litan yanpona. And so me tan yanpona e lipu is something like, again, I make the book be caused by, be from yanpona, right? We're making a claim about it later. If I say me tan, it could accidentally claim that you were the cause of it. And otherwise, if you're talking about like cause and attribution, you could accidentally involve yourself in that, where in this case, you're intentionally trying to attribute it to somebody else. Right? But yeah, there are certainly cases where if I say me tan, it will be something like me toki ni in the case of like, I feel like a similar case is something like I told you so. That turn of phrase in English where it's like, oh yeah, I talked about this before, right? Me tan, I am the cause of this, right? It's not perfect, I would say. It doesn't quite express the same thing, but it's a similar case insofar as like the degree of expression and what you're getting at, right? Like, I am responsible for this statement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good explanation.
Cool. Yeah, so I would say tan as a transitive prepositional phrase. Again, it's a little bit, excuse me, it is a little bit clunkier than the others because, again, it kind of fiddles with causality and attribution. And those things are a little open-ended. I think it would be better in most cases to express ownership. To say, sina yo eni, or maybe nili iyo sina. As in, you have this, or this is your thing, right? Both of those, again, might be better ways to express yourself as far as attribution and causality. When it comes to transitive prepositional phrases, those might be better than tan, right? And it's also totally okay to say, nilitan yan ni, like this thing is caused by this person. You get a similar effect. And I think, actually, that's something worth thinking about a little bit as well, is the fact that generally when you do have a transitive prepositional phrase, you do get a similar statement by simply taking the preposition, moving it to the end, adjusting the statement a little bit to compensate, right? That is very often true. Like, in the previous example, where I gave, what was it? Mi samasina e tawamusi mi. I make my dancing similar to yours. And then the counterexample I gave was mi tawamusi samasina. These are very similar statements. As I noted before, they do have differences, but again, transitive prepositional phrases, you can usually break the preposition out, move it to the normal location that it goes, and call it good, right? So I'm going to move on to the last word, and hopefully this won't take too long because we've only got a few minutes left. But this one if any of you are familiar with the teaching process in Mapona and Kamasona, the different servers for Toki Pona, you're probably familiar with the trouble with Kepiken. So, little bit of a history lesson. Kepiken was, prior to Toki Pona, the language of good, taught with an e, as in mi Kepiken e ilo, which mean I use tools or I am using tools, right? And today, and ever since Poo was published, Kepiken is taught only as a preposition, in which you would say mi Kepiken ilo to say I use tools. But this left Kepiken without a verb definition. And so this is actually an interesting case where suddenly we're now reintroducing the idea of Kepiken as a verb to mean some kind of using. But since this is a transitive prepositional phrase, we're now applying this to something else rather than saying we're using that something, right? So let's say mi Kepiken ilo moku e yan lili. I make the small person use tools, use food tools. Or I make the kid use utensils. Which, if you've ever dealt with a little kid, is a problem you will have to face in life. I promise. But mi Kepiken ilo moku e yan lili. In this case, we need to go back to that attribution idea. Mi Kepiken yan. Or mi Kepiken e yan. Excuse me. So the core of the sentence is just those 4 words. Mi Kepiken e yan. Right? And again, historical Toki Pona would tell you that means I am using a person, as though they were a tool. But modern Toki Pona says this is an application. We are applying using to the person. And transitive prepositional phrases actually do give us a way to express that which is distinct from applying using, right? In this case, we actually are saying, I am applying using to something. But in this case, it has a distinct purpose, right? Or a distinct tool attribution. Mi Kepiken ilo moku e yan lili. As in, I make this person use tools, right? If we add the one more word, Kepiken ilo. I make this person use a food tool. And this is actually very, very interesting because to express this differently, you could say, let's see, mi ni tawa yan lili ona o Kepiken. Gracious. Ilo moku. So the restatement here is actually pretty long, right? Mi ni tawa yan lili. I do this to the small person, right? Ona o Kepiken ilo moku, right? And here we've avoided using a transitive prepositional phrase, but now the statement is a lot longer. And I guess it's also worth mentioning here that I made a slight mistake. You wouldn't say ona o Kepiken, because that would mean something like they must use it, but not necessarily that they're already doing so. You would say ona li Kepiken ilo moku. They are using a food tool, right? Altogether, we now have a case where, yeah, we can state this, mi Kepiken ilo moku e yan lili, without a transitive prepositional phrase, and you could probably shrink this statement a lot further. But it's not going to be quite as succinct as this original statement. That original statement is small. Again, This is part of the power of transitive prepositional phrases in general. So here, we actually do have a meaning for kepiken as a verb, or more exactly as a transitive prepositional phrase, right? Or rather being used in a transitive prepositional phrase. And so we can apply using to something. Any questions about kepiken? No questions? All right. Well, I would like to thank absolutely everyone here for coming. Thank you so much for the excellent questions. I hope you learned something awesome today. O Toki Pona. O Musi Pona.